Right, welcome back, and let me again welcome our distinguished guest, Ambassador Hamdy Saleh from Assistant Foreign Minister, and back to where we stopped. And actually, Sir, you spoke about different angles in which the press conference that was held touched on. A number of files. First, they started with the relationships. The relationship between both countries. Second, they touched on the strategic partnership and cooperation. Third, they spoke about regional and international issues of mutual concern. I mean, there were a number of files. If we can divide each of them, let us start with the bilateral relations between both countries, and what does this exactly visit means for it?
As I mentioned in my introductory comments, basically both presidents expressed their own views about the philosophy behind this meeting between the two cultures, the culture from France and the culture from Egypt, Egypt representing the Islamic world and France representing the West. And as Macron talked about the Enlightenment, about the French Revolution, he talks about, you know, his heritage of Western civilization. President Sisi talks about our heritage of Islamic civilization. So the communication in terms of philosophy, of philosophical ideas, were interesting, were convincing, and was good. And it also, to a very good point, Macron emphasized that, you know, whatever happened with regard to the paintings describing the Prophet ﷺ, is not really representing the state of France, is not representing the president of the state. It does represent this individual, and this individual by himself is not really that significant. But the most important point, that all these things should not really instigate violence. And that was a very important point which Macron said, and which was also emphasized by President Fattah al-Sisi. The way how they really dealt with each other to establish a common denominator, you know, commonality of values, was very interesting, and I really appreciated that very much. Second, this is involving the entire communication between the two presidents, the philosophical framework. But then comes the filing of the strategic points, which you mentioned too. To what extent a medium-sized country like Egypt and an important point, you know, power in Europe, France, both of them behind them, the European Union.
I would not want really to say a medium-sized country like Egypt. I
All right.
would not.
At any rate, you know, this is how the realism in politics talks about it, in terms of a country which has behind it the European Union, a country, Egypt, which is behind it the Arab League and the Islamic Union, so the Islamic world. So both countries represent a major power, a major group of countries, and they can do a lot. So in their dialogue about the strategic issues, they talked about all the files you mentioned about, or at least that's what they said in their own press conference. And I think there is to a large extent, you know, a very clear endorsement of the ideas, of the French ideas and of the Egyptian ideas to each other. They endorse the ideas of how to deal with the Eastern Mediterranean crisis, particularly the role of Turkey, and the instigation of problems which Turkey has been doing in the Eastern Mediterranean. Also, they talked about Libya, and you know, apparently there is clear agreement between Egypt and France about how the scenario could be developed in terms of proceeding with the peace process in Libya and establishing stability there. And then they came to the point of talking about, you know, Lebanon as well. So these three files were very important there, and I think that was important that they mentioned that in the press conference, but I think the scenarios which will later come out after the discussion will be revealed later on.
What do you mean by the scenarios that...
What ideas is going to be, new ideas will emerge out of these meetings to push the peace process in Libya, to push for stability in Lebanon, to push for you know, the peace process between the Palestinians and Israeli. Definitely the meeting between two major countries like this, representing the main blocks in the Northern Mediterranean and the Southern Mediterranean, will have some impact on the process in these three major problems.
Well, actually, as both leaders said, that topping their agenda was also the issue of terrorism and the importance of combating terrorism through cooperation and coordination between both or all sides. And that what Egypt has been calling for since a long time ago. So how far do you see this very particular file on the agenda of the French-Egyptian cooperation at this upcoming stage?
French-Egyptian cooperation on what?
On this upcoming stage.
On terrorism?
Yes.
Of course, there is a total agreement between the Egyptian leadership and the French leadership about how to combat terrorism. And you know, France lately have been suffering enormously from terrorism, and apparently they have a deeper understanding of the problem and of the agonies which really is caused by terrorism. And as a result of that, I believe that the French will come with some ideas, and the Egyptian will come with some ideas, and I think they will develop new ideas of how to cooperate together in terms of combating terrorism. Now, terrorism now is not really an issue which is domestic. It's not really within France or within Europe. It is actually happening in the Sahel, in Africa, and the French troops are there to combating terrorism over there in the Sahel. It's also happening in
Mali.
other parts of the Middle East. And that's what they mentioned. They mentioned that in the press conference. So a wider perspective, which Egypt has in combating terrorism, with the same, it's very close to the wider perspective that the French have with regard to combating terrorism, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, whether in the Sahel or parts of Europe and parts of Africa or whatever. Already there is mechanisms which we have cooperation, I believe, cooperation between our two countries, how to deal with that. But I think this meeting will be important at a juncture to develop new ideas and to move a little bit further in this regard.
You respectively said that also this summit talks touched on regional files, including Libya, including Syria, including Lebanon. Iraq was also part of it, and the Palestinian cause. How far do you think there were any kind of similarities, or there were similarities between the French and the Egyptian points of view regarding solutions towards those files?
Yeah, let's take the case in point, which is Libya. Egypt has been clear of denouncing the importation of mercenaries to Libya, which has been done by Turkey and financed by Qatar and so on. France has been very clear about that, denouncing the importation and the bringing of mercenaries to Libya. Egypt has been clear about the fact that, you know, the Libyans have to decide their own destiny, apart from the foreign powers. France has the same position. The two countries support the idea that the United Nations can lead the process to that, and that has been emphasized by both Macron and the Sisi in this meeting. You know, if there is some areas which are not really clear about, you know, the total agreement is very limited. But in the final analysis, the Libyan problem is complex, and the French have a role to play. Egypt has a very important role to play because we are the neighbor and we are the strategic partner of whatever happens in Libya. So I think the cooperation will lead somewhere. The problem with Libya, though, is that you have other forces, which was mentioned during the press conference, but not by the president himself or the President Macron, but by the journalists, about Turkey. Turkey is a spoiler. It's playing a game which is really very bad in Libya and very bad in the Eastern Mediterranean at large. To what extent, you know, the European Union will be able to check the Turkish behavior is a question mark. But Egypt is clear about its position that it has to be checked. And also, it was both the presidents were clear about the fact that, you know, the process which we have now has to move on and to lead to a stability in Libya.
Actually, the French president, when speaking about Turkey, because Turkey was brought in the press conference twice by a French journalist and an Egyptian. So President Macron here spoke very firmly that they will not allow any country, and he spoke in general, but the question was about Turkey, to disturb the interests of European countries and the part of the Mediterranean. So I guess he was so clear on this point. But what we were speaking here is what kind of bilateral cooperation between France as a big power and Egypt with regard to the Turkish interference, because the Turkish interference is not just in Libya, rather it is in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, and in many other countries. Maybe the part which France is interested in is the Mediterranean and the Libyan territorial waters, but also the interference of Turkey in other regional states. So,
as you mentioned, Turkey has been interfering in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and even the Palestinian issue, and even around the globe in other parts, in even Somalia and so on. Turkey has been a spoiler in Libya, and a major threat to the Eastern Mediterranean by where they send their ships around Cyprus and around the Greek islands and so on. So it is clear that there is a major problem with Turkey. France has moved, and the French president not only visited Lebanon, but visited also Iraq. France and the French president was really concerned about what's happening in Iraq and happening in Lebanon. And Egypt also is very much committed to the stability of Iraq and the stability of Lebanon. So to a large extent, we are in the same boat, trying to reach a certain, agreement on what to do together. And I think this conference is important to try to see what other steps could be done to check the role of the spoilers which Turkey is playing, and to move a little bit further towards more stability. The problem that the southern part of the Mediterranean is so in a very bad shape. I mean, there's so many crises, so many wars around. And unless the two countries, as I mentioned, the one from the northern Mediterranean, France, and Egypt from the southern Mediterranean, cooperate to try to contain these issues, I think these issues can flare up for a long time. So I think it's a very good point that the president was able to make this visit at this particular time, and to really develop a scenario of cooperation with France in these major issues, not only facing the region, but facing the world at large.
Lebanon is of special importance to France. We've seen the French president going to Lebanon himself, following up with the developments there, and we have seen after even the big dramatic loss that took place in Lebanon, also the French existence was tremendous. Why is Lebanon so important for France, and how far do you see the French existence in Lebanon important? How far do you see a kind of balance between the Arab and foreign interference in Lebanon would be important?
To start with, I would like to emphasize that Lebanon is very important to Egypt.
Definitely.
I would like to remind the audience that most of the educated class from Lebanon immigrated to Egypt, and they really helped to develop with us the culture renaissance which Egypt had in the 19th century. So the relationship between the culture as a renaissance in Lebanon and the culture as a cultural renaissance in Egypt was so closely tied up. So Lebanon is very important to the Arab world at large, but particularly to Egypt, because we are the two countries who really moved very fast in the early 19th century to be able to develop a modern state and so on. And the relationship between the two nations are very important. Now comes France. It has a special relationship with Egypt, and it has a special relationship with Lebanon at the same time. You know, from the Napoleonic Wars until now, France always has a special relationship with the two countries. So I think that's very balanced approach from France to try to really assist the Lebanese to move on. The role which Macron has been playing is important. Unfortunately, it's not successful. Unfortunately, the forces, the political forces in Lebanon are not really moving towards establishing even a cabinet. And this is really...
Saad Hariri was elected, right?
Yeah, but there is no cabinet.
Yes.
He has been trying for 3 months, I think, 2 months and a half, to submit a cabinet to the president, and it's not successful. So as a result of that, Lebanon does not have a cabinet, does not have a government. It has a designated prime minister, but he's not in power yet. And the country is in a very bad shape, financially, politically, security-wise even. There is so many assassinations, there is so many explosions and so on. So Egypt and France have very high concern about Lebanon, because Lebanon is very important to us as Egypt and to the Arab world at large. And if we can work together to help the Lebanese to move beyond this stage and to establish stability and to really develop themselves to really, because they are at the brink of a crisis, a real crisis. And Lebanon is not really worth that. The Lebanese are very well educated, and they are people who are very hard worker, and I think they need to move beyond this crisis and to really rebuild Lebanon again.
Maybe because also they say that Lebanon is Paris of the Middle East. This is how people call Lebanon.
Well, I think Alexandria is Paris of the Middle East, but it's okay.
Alexandria is the...
Every country can say.
Yes, anyway, before we continue on with our discussion, let's have the second report. And upon his arrival in Paris, President Sisi met with French top officials on means of enhancing bilateral ties in various fields. The head of state held talks with the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, as well as the French Defense Minister and the Paris mayor. Let's watch the report.
After holding summit talks with his French counterpart, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi met on Monday with Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo at the Paris municipal headquarters. Earlier on Monday morning, the head of state also met French Minister of Defense Florence Parly. President al-Sisi received an official reception ceremony, and the national anthems of the two countries were played. A statement by presidential spokesperson Bassam Radi said that President al-Sisi voiced Egypt's keenness to strengthen military and security relations and armament systems with France, adding that both sides tackled aspects of military cooperation in the next phase. Earlier, President al-Sisi, who arrived in Paris on a 2-day visit on Sunday evening, met with French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian at the French Foreign Ministry's headquarters. Al-Sisi and Le Drian discussed the latest regional developments focusing on the Eastern Mediterranean, Libya and Syria. President al-Sisi stressed that the support of the international community is the way to resolve crises, face meddling attempts, uproot terrorism, and achieve balance among regional countries. Al-Sisi added that Egypt is keen on boosting its strategic partnership with France as a cornerstone for security and stability in the Mediterranean region and the Middle East. He also said that now is the time to support dialogue between the Islamic and the European worlds, with each respecting the differences of the other. President al-Sisi highlighted the need to support bridges of communication and paths of dialogue to reach an understanding between the two worlds based on respect of the other. For his part, the French Foreign Minister said that France is looking forward to promoting bilateral cooperation in multiple fields and coordinating with Egypt on the Middle East affairs. The two sides tackled recent updates of the Palestinian cause and means to revive the peace process in the Middle East.
Right, welcome back, and back to you, Ambassador Saleh. And before we move to other important meetings the President held with other high-ranking officials, or French high-ranking officials, let me here speak about a part that was also in the press conference by both President, the file of the human rights. And that was raised by, it was definitely the first question by French journalists in just after the statements of both leaders. How far do you think that this file was tackled? How far do you think that the President has been able to cover aspects of this usual question for the French?
In any meeting between two leaders and any summit between two leaders of two countries, usually there are three areas which could be discussed. The area of the general outlook of politics or political orientation in general, and that was covered in a sense. And it, as we mentioned, it talked about, not only the relationship between the two countries and two culture, but also between the Western culture and the Islamic culture. And then the second part is basically about, the regional issues and how these two countries can handle these issues, and we covered that. But the third part is about bilateral relations, to what extent we can, as two countries, really work with each other and benefit from each other. And that was very important because Macron emphasized that the cooperation between the two countries should not be conditional. It should not be conditional because there is a need for each other. There is, France needs Egypt and Egypt needs France. They need each other in dealing with these tremendous problems, in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, and the threats of Turkey, the threats of terrorism, the threats of the COVID-19, of all these things. It's tremendous problems facing the entire world, and of course facing the two countries together. So this particular point is very important, the fact that both countries understand that you cannot make any issues to condition their own bilateral relations. Then comes the issue of asking about human rights, about political freedom and so on. And that issue is really related to what extent you are talking about a country which has so many problems, like Egypt, in terms of economic problems, in terms of the increase of population, in terms of the conflict between what you call fundamentalism and fair-minded, open-minded Islam, and to what extent all these conflicting issues affect the stability of the system. And the understanding of the Western, the Western society to this is limited. They do not understand to what extent these things are really constraints on a country like Egypt. So when they talk about human rights, they perceive themselves as if they are living in their own country, whereas the problems in their country is different from the problems in this country here. So in both cases, whenever Macron responded to that and the President Sisi responded to that, they really presented this issue that, we have to understand the issue in its own context. Particularly, President Sisi mentioned Egypt has been moving along, trying to protect human rights, trying to really enhance political freedom, but at the same time it's facing major problem, which is terrorism, which is conflicting between the extremists and the majority of the Muslims, and also facing the economic hardship, and facing also the issues of the regional threats. So all these factors together affect the very delicate balance which the Egyptian authority and the Egyptian government has to take between, security and protecting human rights. And that delicate balance is an issue which has been discussed continuously. So I think in this press conference it was raised, but it was responded to adequately, I think.
Two main other files were raised here, and I guess one of them was how Egypt overcame or is coping with the COVID-19 period. Hopefully that would end soon. Anyway, how Egypt has dealt so far, and the economic file, and how to boost cooperation between both sides in the economic file.
I was impressed with the fact that President Sisi was really promoting Egypt in terms of tourism, in terms of economic cooperation, in terms of investment. It was very impressive that in spite of the fact that you are talking in the middle of so many difficult issues and very explosive crises and so on, still he had the time to really emphasize that we need to work on these three areas together: the investment,
tourism,
the cooperation in economic affairs, economic development, and also dealing with the issues of COVID-19 and so on. And then mentioning in particular that that the country Egypt is dealing with this problem adequately, that that the rate of the COVID-19 is very limited relative to other countries. And he emphasized that the fact that particularly the resort areas of that which tourists can come to, there is none. The COVID-19 is very limited, maybe non-existent. So I think that was a very good message to be mentioned at this particular press conference. However, we are now at the beginning of a new stage. The vaccines and the hopes which people have all over the world that we'll be able to deal with that. It is very, very impressive that the problem came from China about 10 months ago or 11 months ago, and now 8 months later, after they started the game, the Americans and the Europeans were able to develop a vaccine. It's a very impressive thing to be able to do that in 8 months. And hopefully, if that's effective as high as they are talking about, 95% for this one.
We're speaking about 4 kinds from 4 countries so far. Yeah, right?
So if the vaccines are really effective, I think we will be able to move beyond this critical stage of the pandemic and go a little bit further in really establishing again the economic stability and moving on. So the message was we have to cooperate in this and we have to move together in this scenario.
Yes. There were other meetings the president made, a meeting that was made with the French foreign minister the day before, or in preparation for the meeting with the president. There was also a meeting between President Sisi and the defense minister, the French defense minister, and the French mayor. If we speak about his meeting with the defense minister, because they spoke about boosting or strengthening military and security relations. How far do you see that this is important, particularly when both countries are in the circumstances that are occurring in the Mediterranean?
Usually in a summit between two leaders, they discuss the general outlook and the outlines, and then they leave the details and more technicalities to deal with the specialized agencies and ministers. It is important usually to meet with the foreign minister because he will fill in the gaps with regard to the foreign policy of France with regard to these issues, where probably the first meeting with the president will not be able to fill everything. It's very important as well with regard to the Minister of Defense to also talk about particular capabilities which can be developed together between the two countries in order to face the threats of in the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean, and probably threats from from whatever terrorist groups and so on. So in these two meetings, probably the more in details type of discussion came up. I'm not really familiar with what will happen or what could have been discussed, but what I'd like to emphasize is that Egypt was able successfully to develop a very close military cooperation with France, and with the importation of several, French technology in terms of military technology, and the cooperation even in maneuvers and so on. All this really helped to develop a certain rapprochement between the two armies and the two military forces. But there would come also other meetings, not only the Minister of Defense and Minister of there would be meetings with probably the ministers, dealing with the investment, dealing with the economy, and dealing with the international cooperation, and probably also with the culture and so on. So on all these things, there is what you call mutual interest between Egypt and France in this. The French have a special interest in the Egyptian history. They always talk about that. They continuously, since they came in with the Napoleonic invasion and wrote the book, the Description de l'Egypte, there is a sense of commitment to the learning about Egyptian history, pharaonic history, and so on. And the culture, the Egyptian culture, is very, intriguing to the French culture. So it is very important to really work on this, to develop this dimension of a cultural relationship between the French and the Egyptian.
Definitely, culture for France is, I guess, the best. I mean, here we're speaking here about philosophers that has put, or that have put, because they are many, the philosophy of some of the most important developments that took place in the whole world right after that, right? Most of the revolutions, Descartes and I can't remember now. I don't know. Anyway, culture is very important, but also we're speaking about economy, and definitely there were some important discussions between both presidents about the economy between both countries and how to boost such relations.
The framework of cooperation between Egypt and France goes on three levels. One is government to government, so how government to government cooperation in economic issues, whether the French government itself has been participating in some programs and giving some assistance in some programs, so that's one level. The second level is basically the companies, the French companies and the Egyptian companies developing joint ventures and working together. The most important parts in the French investment is usually in the oil industry, Total and so on. But also they have other areas where they have been involved in the food industry and so on. So the French companies have been active, and the French investment has been expanding. But the third level is a direct investment. Basically, when Egypt needs to raise funds for a particular project, so they go to the stock market worldwide and to try to raise funds for the projects and so on, which they are interested to build. And I think that's a third level, which is the investment, in particular, how to deal with the investors and with the associations who control the investment. So in a sense, I think the discussion was focused on one or two of the projects in each area. And I think there would be something clear after the end of the visit, to what extent this meeting concluded some agreements in these three areas.
Yes. Finally, here, if we may speak about how do you view the Egyptian-French relations in terms of how they show a model for relations between two different cultures in the Mediterranean.
Yani, as I mentioned, this is a historical process. Egypt and France have been partners for a long time. It has a historical significance, and it has also a geopolitical significance. As I mentioned, France is one of the most important countries in the northern Mediterranean. Egypt is the most important country in the southern Mediterranean. So the cooperation is a natural thing. They have a process of cooperation for a long time, and I think they can develop that in the future, as you said, as a model of cooperation between two countries.
I guess that would lead me also to the future relations between Egypt from one side and France as one of the big representatives to the European Union at large. We are aware that the President, or this visit, is a European visit, which will take him after that to other European countries. So your assessment to the future relations between Egypt and the European Union state members at large?
I, as an individual, I had high hopes about and on the European Union, that they will be acting more forcefully to really help resolve issues in Lebanon, in Libya, and in Iraq, and so on. But unfortunately, the European Union is divided, and they are unable to really move as a one bloc, and the different orientation is really affecting their policy. But anyway, the best thing is to deal with each country as it is, and to deal with the European Union at large as well. So I think the visit by the President to France, and maybe if he is going to other countries, I think that will be very helpful to develop our relations with the European Union.
Yes, definitely. Our time is out, and I have to end it here. Ambassador Hamdy Saleh from Mrs. Foreign Minister, thank you so much for being with us and for your input tonight. Dear viewers, many thanks for watching. Tomorrow we'll be continuing with the President's visit to France and European Union, other European Union states. Until tomorrow, it's good night.